Don't worry, I can't afford to do this either. Today's video is brought to you by Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes to inspire you to stretch your creativity and expand your horizons. Whether you're interested in leveling up your skills at work, making a career change to a new field, or pursuing a budding passion, Skillshare is bound to have something for you. No matter your interests, like cooking, woodworking, photography, Skillshare makes it easy to browse through classes based on topics and sort through criteria that meet your needs. Behind the scenes, we've been working on streamlining and improving our own workflow when it comes to video editing. The Advanced Video Editing with Adobe Premiere Pro class by Jordy Vandeput has a ton of great pointers we've already started using to bring you videos like this. Level up your real-life skill tree with Skillshare. Visit Skillshare.com/craftcomputing or follow the link down in the video description, and the first 1,000 people will get 1 month of free premium membership. That's Skillshare.com/craftcomputing, and again, thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. Welcome back to Craft Computing, everyone. As always, I'm Jeff. Now, I've only been testing out my 45-drive Stereohopic AV15 for the last few weeks, but those who have followed the channel for long enough know what happens next. Of course I'm already upgrading it. The motherboard inside the Stereohopic happens to have support for Intel Optane persistent memory DIMMs, and I've been wanting to check those out for at least the last couple years. But a couple upgrades have to take place before you can just go slapping those in place. So if XeonBot would kindly pass over this CPU, we can get started. The first thing you'll need on top of the motherboard is a CPU that will actually support Optane persistent memory DIMMs, and this was pretty much the cheapest one that I could afford. This is a qualified sample of an Intel Xeon Gold 5218N, 16-core, 32-threaded CPU with a 2.3 GHz base clock and a 3.2 GHz max turbo. I managed to pick this up for just $199 on eBay, but as per usual, I can't necessarily recommend that you go with the qualified sample route, as who knows what CPU you're actually going to get. In my case, I did wind up with an Intel Xeon 5218N, but your mileage may vary. Whether or not I was going to fill this thing up with Optane DIMMs, you know I was probably going to upgrade the memory anyway, so I had already purchased 384 gigabytes of DDR4 registered ECC to slap in here. Now, it just so happens that that was also a requirement of the Optane DIMMs, so I was one step ahead of the game already. And now we come to the most expensive DIMM modules I have ever bought in my entire life. That includes personally or professionally. These were $500 a piece and are 512 gigabyte Optane persistent memory modules. For those paying attention, yes, I will have about 1.38 terabytes of memory installed in the DIMM slots of this Stereohopic, but it's not quite that cut and dry. So follow me out to the garage, let's get all of this installed, and let's take a look at some of the configuration options we have with these very expensive modules. So this will be my first time installing an LGA 3647 CPU. I know that sounds a little weird, but like I said, these have been fairly expensive on the secondary market until very, very recently. Also, I've talked about this before, but it is always a fantastic idea to have your servers on Rails so you can very quickly access them and even work on them. All right, and out she comes. So inside here, you can see our existing setup. We've got our 128 gigabytes of DDR4 ECC registered memory across 4 DIMM slots. That is 4 32 gigabyte DIMMs. And we have our 4118 Xeon Silver CPU, which is an 8-core unit. However, again, the Xeon Silver does not support Intel Optane DIMM, so we'll be swapping all of that out today. So as far as the RAM upgrade goes, we're going from the 4 DIMM slots that we have currently all the way up to 6, and that's because the Xeon Gold is a 6-channel memory supported CPU. Now, if you look down inside of here, you'll notice that we have 3 blue DIMM slots and a single black DIMM slot on each side of the CPU. So we have more than enough room for 6 channels of memory as well as 2 Optane DIMMs. Now, you can populate these with different combinations of DDR4 memory and Optane if you have different needs in mind. But before we get to the really fun part of installing the memory, we have to remove our CPU, which is one of the most frightening parts, as the LGA 3647 socket doesn't have a retention mechanism. It relies instead on the pressure from the heatsink to keep the CPU mounted down. And as you can tell, there's assembly and disassembly instructions right on top of this thing. So we're going 4, 3, 2, 1 for disassembly, and for assembly, we'll go the opposite direction. Now, when you take the CPU out, you want to take note of the orientation, and you can do that by the little gold triangle right up there. You'll notice the other 3 corners do not have that triangle. Orient that with your fan so you know how to install the CPU back on this retainer before you put it back in the socket to avoid damage to it. So we've got our CPU that we're removing as well as the one that we're putting in, and as you can see, I've oriented them in the same way. So the triangle is in the top left. Now, removing this can be a little bit dicey as the bracket is held on to the heatsink by these plastic clips. So don't break it, and also don't let your CPU go flying as you remove it. And there we go. Set that aside for a moment. And then clean off our heatsink. Then to remove the CPU from the bracket, simply give it a little bit of a bend, and it removes the clips, and your CPU can pop right out. Then installing the new CPU is pretty much the exact same process in reverse. So we're going to take our CPU and put it into this bracket right here. Just give it a little bit of a bend and make sure those clips hold it in place. And then, again, making sure that our triangle is in the upper left corner, reinstall this onto the heatsink. Just like that. And I think we're ready to put this thing back in. All right, and then we're going to very carefully drop this thing back into place, lining it up on the 2 pegs. And then just like a regular CPU, I'm going to give it just a little bit of a wiggle to make sure it is actually seated in place. Then we screw it down in the order it says on top. So screw number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4. And there we go. We have a Xeon 5218N CPU upgrade. Next up, we're going to install our system memory, and here I have 6 64GB 3200 MTS DDR4 registered ECC DIMMs. Try saying that 5 times fast. And lining it up with the slot on the first try. There we go. So we're going to put 3 of them into each side of the CPU. Along with one of our 512GB Optane DIMMs. There we go. Come on. There we go. All right. Last one. I promise. And there we go. That should be one upgraded system.
Alright, so we installed our Intel Xeon Gold 5218N 16-core 2nd generation scalable CPU, 384GB of DDR4 registered ECC, and a full terabyte of Intel Optane DC persistent memory, otherwise known as Intel PMEM. So, what exactly is Optane PMEM, and what can we actually do with it? First off, keep in mind I am taking a look at 1st generation Optane DIMMs only, and all the information here isn't necessarily compatible with 2nd gen sticks or configurations. 1st gen Intel Optane DIMMs are only compatible with 2nd generation Intel scalable CPUs, and need gold or platinum SKUs for support. 2nd generation Optane DIMMs are only compatible with 3rd generation Xeon scalable CPUs, and the same gold or platinum SKU limitation remains. Optane PMEM is a hybrid memory and storage solution, combining some of the best aspects of traditional system memory and flash storage, and it has 3 modes of operation. It can work as insanely high capacity system memory, it can work as insanely fast access storage, or as a combination of the two.
But of course, like any perfect sounding solution, there are benefits and drawbacks to each mode versus traditional NAND flash or volatile system memory. What makes Optane DIMMs special is they are high capacity and non-volatile, meaning that when the sticks lose power, the memory stored on them is not lost like it is with standard system memory. This is because they use flash chips that are normally found in NVMe SSDs instead of on DDR memory. The downside is that these chips have a higher latency and lower overall bandwidth than DDR4, but these are still significantly lower latency than NVMe-based storage. It also doesn't require any PCI Express lanes for connectivity, communicating instead directly with the CPU's memory controller. It's also important to note that Optane DIMMs are not a complete replacement for DDR memory. You'll still need traditional system memory for the server to boot up. You'll also need to check supported configurations for populating DIMM slots with a mix of Optane and traditional memory to fit your needs. With the boring part out of the way, let's start off with using Optane as system memory, as that's the default mode when you install them into the server. The first thing you'll notice that in the BIOS, the only memory that will show up as system memory are the Optane DIMMs that you have installed. So in this case, I'll have 1 terabyte of system memory available. In memory mode, the Optane DIMMs are used as your server's system memory pool, while the DDR4 DRAM is used as a lower latency cache. The obvious benefit here is lower cost and higher capacity memory, though remember to keep in mind that Optane DIMMs are still higher latency and slower than DDR. But considering a single 64GB DIMM of ECC DDR4 runs between $2 and $250, you can get up to 4 times the memory capacity for the same price, as a 256GB DIMM of Optane will run you about the same. In memory mode, ideally you'll install your DRAM with between a 1:16 and a 1:4 ratio with your Optane DIMMs. That is 1GB of DRAM for every 4GB of Optane memory. The most correct configuration for the Craftinator here would have been 256 gigs of system memory to 1 terabyte of Optane, but even though this isn't perfect, doesn't mean it won't work. While in memory mode, Optane memory will function exactly like system memory, as in it's completely invisible to your applications and there's no special sauce to make it work. But you also won't get any of the advantages of it being physically non-volatile either. A power outage will still cause memory to be wiped, as your Optane DIMMs don't actually contain the memory being used or being written. That's handled by the DRAM cache before being transferred to Optane. One other important note, when in memory mode, Optane DIMM capacities are not limited by your CPU's memory controller. For example, the Xeon Gold 5218N that I installed in the server has support for up to 1 terabyte of DDR4 memory. But remember, in this mode, the server presents Optane memory as system memory while using your actual DRAM as a cache. You could, in theory, install 2 terabytes of Optane DIMMs alongside 512 gigabytes of DDR4 and present 2 terabytes of RAM to your system. 2 terabytes of DDR4 would not normally be supported by the CPU SKU, but it is an option to extend memory capacities, again while keeping in mind any potential drawbacks. Testing out memory speeds, the good news is that I'm seeing the same speeds and latency with or without the Optane DIMMs installed. The bad news is, I think it's because I'm only actually testing the DRAM system cache, not the speed of the Optane DIMMs. So quite a bit more testing and tweaking is going to be needed to see what the actual performance differences are between DRAM and Optane. But if you simply need more system memory, even at the expense of speed, well, let's just say I couldn't have afforded 1 terabyte of memory any other way. Over in the much more complicated corner is what's known as Optane AppDirect mode. What makes it complicated is there's more than one way to utilize Optane DIMMs in this mode. But first, let's talk about what the differences are between AppDirect and memory modes. When using memory mode, your server and operating system work as if nothing has changed at all. All the memory management happens behind the scenes, and applications will simply use the Optane memory as if it were regular system RAM. In AppDirect mode, you are going to have to pay attention to the memory controller limit on your Xeon CPU. So again, it is 1 terabyte for my Xeon 5218N. That puts my current configuration at a bit of a disadvantage, as I have a total of 1.38 terabytes installed between DRAM and Optane memory. But I'll address that again as we get closer to the end of the video. The good news is, AppDirect mode doesn't require any specific memory ratios to achieve the best performance, so simply install what fits your needs between the two DIMM types. Unlike memory mode, AppDirect presents both memory pools to your server, both DRAM and Optane, but all services will simply use system memory if not specifically instructed to use the Optane pool. Most of the time, AppDirect will need to be specifically supported by the software that you're running, or your development team will need to add in support themselves. This mode is designed for massive database tables and big data the likes of which that I've never worked with. Seriously, the biggest SQL tables that I ever managed were in the tens of gigabytes, not thousands. But AppDirect mode has one more trick up its sleeve, and it's a particularly interesting one when it comes to virtualization environments. You can create block storage devices directly from the Optane DIMMs and then attach them directly to a virtual machine. That's storage that is directly attached to your CPU, in theory providing lower latency and faster speeds than just about any other solution. At least that's what I'm hoping for, since these DIMMs were $500 a piece. But I think that's why you all watch my channel. You've had crazy ideas with enterprise hardware, and you want to watch me spend my money and fail with them, so you don't have to. So when it comes to testing out Optane PMEM as a storage solution, holy crap, how can I replace all of my storage servers with these? I guess join the Patreon. Now, I went into this expecting better speeds than NVMe Gen 3x4, at least when it comes to certain metrics, but I still wasn't prepared for the performance boost that I saw. Now, there are a lot of crazy numbers in this benchmark chart, but let's take a look at the random read-write burst test, as I think that pretty much sums everything up. This is basically the bottom number on the chart when you run Crystal Disk Mark, and it's not that flattering for any storage medium. Here, the Gen 3x4 NVMe drive manages a read of 66 megabytes per second and writes of around 44. Latency is also not terrible, with an average lookup time of 0.06 milliseconds and a 95th percentile of 0.31. Well, as Sam Jackson would say, hold on to your butts. Moving the same test over to the Optane PMEM, we see random reads of 1,164 megabytes per second and writes of 776. That's 18 times faster than the NVMe drive. Oh, and latency performance is just as bonkers. The 95th percentile lookup time on the NVMe drive was 0.31 milliseconds, which is one of the metrics that makes them feel fairly snappy when installing an operating system onto them. For the Optane PMEM, the 95th percentile was 0.01 milliseconds. The average lookup time didn't even appear on the chart, as it could only be measured in microseconds. To put these kinds of numbers into some perspective, let's consider performing a Google search, where you send a question to Google and less than half a second later, you have an answer. Well, assuming your monkey brain could type out the correct question, but that's a topic for another video. This random I/O benchmark ran for about 9.5 seconds, and in that amount of time, the server was able to locate 159,819 pieces of data when using the NVMe drive to search through. With Optane, that number jumped to 2.8 million. Now, this level of performance really doesn't matter when it comes to you or even to me, as there's no conceivable process that I can run in my server that would require such low latency or overall throughput. But if you're housing a data center with hundreds or even thousands of terabytes worth of databases, you can see why an array of SSDs just wouldn't be cutting it in some cases. So, two very different methods of using Intel Optane memory in a Xeon server, and a number of major advantages over traditional DRAM or even NAND flash storage. Hybrid products like Optane PMEM often sit between two superior pieces of technology, while not bringing any major advantages in their own right. While DRAM is still lower latency than Optane, and I'm sure if I were able to fill the 384 gigabytes of cache memory that I have, I might see a discrepancy between the two. But Optane memory did exactly what it set out to do, provide a high-capacity memory variant for 1/4 the cost of traditional DRAM, and do it with as few drawbacks as possible. In the process, Optane DIMMs also bring some new tricks to the table, where they can also act as full-time storage and sit closer to the CPU than ever before, drastically improving latency and random throughput. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, I'm not able to run all of my Optane memory in AppDirect mode, as my CPU has a 1 terabyte memory limit on board. However, there is a third mode that you can use for your Optane memory, and that is a combination of memory mode and AppDirect. To do this, you can partition your Optane memory and allocate them to certain modes. In my case, I'm going to take 75% of my Optane DIMMs, that's 768 gigabytes worth, and use those in memory mode. Those will no longer count against my memory total, and I'll have 768 gigabytes of usable system memory, with 384 gigabytes serving as a DRAM cache. That leaves me with 256 gigabytes of Optane DIMMs available, and interestingly enough, 256 gigabytes available left on my controller to use as AppDirect storage. And I plan on using that either as a write cache inside of Proxmox, or even forwarding that directly into my TrueNAS server for a write cache disk there. So, do you need Optane persistent memory DIMMs in your home server? Of course not, but today's enterprise gear is tomorrow's home lab. While $1,000 for 1 terabyte of Optane memory, in addition to the $1,200 or so of DDR4 that I have in this server, might seem insane, that same tech is going to make its way from production to recycling centers soon enough. And keeping an eye on the next generation of servers is part of why we all got into this hobby in the first place. If you have any project ideas that needs 1 terabyte or more of system memory, or microsecond latency for storage, let me know down in the comments below. Links on where to find everything you saw in this video will also be down in the video description. Make sure to give those a click. On your way down there, make sure to drop this video a like and subscribe to Craft Computing if you haven't done so already. Follow me on Twitter at Craft Computing for daily shenanigans like this. And if you like the content you see on this channel and want to help support me in what I do, like buying a terabyte of Optane memory, think about joining the Patreon. Link is also down in the video description. And that is going to do it for me in this one. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next video. Cheers, guys. Giving specs on beer is somehow markedly more difficult than giving specs for PC parts. Beer for today is the latest Stereohopic IPA variant from Lagunitas. This one is the Volume 4 featuring Lotus and Sabro hops, clocking in at 7.2%. You know, for a West Coast IPA, this is a remarkably malt-forward beer. The hops are, dare I say, almost an afterthought to the start of this beer. You get this very rich, almost slightly chewy kind of flavor profile to it. And then you're just left with the clinginess of the hops, a little bit of oil and a little bit of a dry finish. Overall, I have to say I'm really impressed with the flavor though. You know what this reminds me of? And follow me here. Banana Nut Crunch. You know, the world's best breakfast cereal. But soaked in IPA. And I don't think that's a bad combo.